It's been a minute since I released a video, but I thought to start the new year, I would do a new series of videos. And one of the advantages of being a bit older and having been in the music business for as long as I have is the relationships and friendships that you forge along the way. I have some of the most interesting and talented friends, and I thought it might benefit others to do a series of interviews with these gifted people and discuss their journeys and successes in the music business. Today marks the first video in a series of videos, Doug's Awesomely Talented Friends. My goal here is not to show off how many interesting people I know, but to talk with them and dive into their journey in the music business and how they ended up where they are today. I sincerely hope that these interviews will inspire you and show you that there are many different ways to find success in the music business. As you'll discover in this series of videos, one seldom ends up where they thought they would, but they're usually happy to be there. My ultimate goal here is to inspire you, the viewer, to pursue your passion in the music industry, knowing that there are many different paths to success. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. And here's the first in the series of Doug's Awesomely Talented Friends with Los Angeles-based composer Andy Kubashevsky, who started as a local Cleveland area musician and session player, and then morphed into a successful songwriter, rock star, and eventually into a BMI award-winning composer. Enjoy the interview. So, Andy, it's good to see you. We've known each other since, God, what, 86, 87?
Probably. I think there was I'm trying to think exactly when it was. It was kind of a Trent and Frank Vale connection to Pi Keyboards, I think.
I worked at Pi Keyboards in audio, which for those of you that don't know, which will probably be most of you, that was the one place between, New York and Chicago where you could get the serious synth shit, like the emulators and the Kurzweil K250s.
Because your boss worked with John Carpenter. Is that who he worked with?
Yeah, he was sort of like a silent owner, Alan Howarth.
Yeah, right.
But he was a partner in Pi Keyboards and Audio. I'm sure he was instrumental too in us getting those particular lines, because in those days, I mean, an emulator too cost as much as a car.
Dude, I spent a lot of hard-earned money at Pi Keyboards and Audio.
Yeah, no, I know.
I still have some of the gear.
And I got that job because Frank Vale and Trent Reznor, who worked there at the time, came to see a little band I was in with just a guitar player, and I was doing all sequencing.
And you opened for Exotic Birds.
And we opened for Exotic Birds when Trent and Frank were in the band.
Right. And then that would have been 86. That would have been when our Loiseau album came out.
So that's when we met, and then Trent left.
Yeah, he was working on Nin, but nobody knew he was working on Nin. I was completely in the dark about the whole Nin thing, and he was like playing with his cover band and Slam Bamboo and some band in Chicago.
Yeah, he was doing it. But he was using my Tascam cassette 8-track on his Nin. On his very, very early Nin demos, before he went to Bart's studio, to start to work on it, because we shared an apartment in Cleveland Heights for a while.
Right, I remember
that. Yeah. So anyway, Trent left to do Nine Inch Nails. I joined Exotic Birds, and I was in the band for a few years. We did the college circuit, and then I went off to New York, and we kind of lost track of each other for a while. And the next thing I know, you're a rock star. Well, first you played drums with
the who's going to be in town Friday here, and I'm going to go.
I see he's on tour. Are you going?
Yeah, I'm on the guest list. I'm going to go hang out with him.
Oh, that's great.
I haven't seen Matt in like 25 years, but DC, the keyboard player, used to live in LA, so I've seen him pretty frequently.
Matt dresses like a 90-year-old man now.
Have you seen him? He's got that British. He wears the what's the hat called? It's got a specific name. He's very British, Matt.
From head to toe.
Oh yeah.
Now I saw that they're on tour, and so after you did a stint with Crowded House?
After I did the Prick album in London,
right?
And then I did a couple of weeks with Crowded House. They were They were in between drummers.
Oh, that was
And
just a short stint.
well, they didn't tell me that. I thought I got the gig, and then 2 weeks or 3 weeks into it, they're like, "Well, hey, we're gonna have to let you go." And I'm like, "Why?" It's like, we had another guy
Oh,
from New
thanks.
Zealand. Yeah, but it was cool, you know. And then I got the gig with Stabbing Westward a couple months
Right.
later.
How did that come about?
When I got the gig in the guy who managed Matt also managed Stabbing Westward. So when their drummer left, they were on tour, their first tour for their first album, and they were on tour supporting Killing Joke. And I got this phone call. I had moved to Atlanta at that point. I was playing in a band with Keith Joyner, who was the touring guitar player in The, and that's how I met Keith. And after The, I went down to Atlanta a bunch of times to work on tracks and eventually got an apartment there. And I had lived in my apartment for literally 2 days. And I came home. It was a Sunday, and I remember it was a Sunday afternoon. I had just gone to the grocery store because I was going to stock the fridge in my apartment, my brand new apartment. And my phone rings, and it's Steve Rennie from Ren Management here in LA saying, "Hey, man, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm going to watch the Atlanta Falcons game. I just went to the store." He's like, "Nope, you're not. Guess what? Tomorrow morning, bright and early, you're flying to LA. You're going to take over the drumming gig for my band, Stabbing Westward." And I was like, "Okay." He's like, "Is there a record store anywhere around?" I'm like, "Yeah, there's a Peaches down the street." Remember Peaches Records?
Yeah, yeah.
And I went down the street, got a CD on the flight from LA from Atlanta to LA. I just, you know, charted out all the songs on the record because they played the songs identical to the record.
Yeah, and this was the first record, right?
Correct. Unguided.
I remember that record.
Yeah. And so I went, and I was just supposed to finish the tour, and it was about, I think it was about 3 months. It was Killing Joke, and then it was a couple other things, all through US and Europe. And then they invited me to Chicago. At this point, I was just a hired gun. I hadn't joined the band. They invited me to Chicago to work on the next record and play drums. And they were paying me, Sony was paying me $1,000 a week.
Yeah, back then that was,
1994 was a lot of money. And I'm like,
sure.
"You guys take as long as you want to write your songs. I'll sit here and make $1,000 a week and play drums."
They're probably still paying that off.
Well, no, because the band eventually got dropped. But so what happened was the drummer left permanently. So I was still, just a studio player at that point. And the singer and the guitar player wrote all the songs, and they had a breakup, and the guitar player got fired. And we were sitting there, and they were like, "Well, he wrote like 3/4 of the songs on the first record." And they asked me, and at this point, they didn't know that I wrote songs. And when I
you've
showed
been
up,
writing songs for a long time.
yeah. And so I showed up. Not only did I bring my drum kits to Chicago because we had a huge rehearsal space, but I brought my ADAT rig. I had 3 ADATs and a Mac, and I had an Emacs.
Yes.
And that's how I wrote songs for the Byrds. I had that in my apartment. So I brought all that, and I said, if you want to do a demo while you guys are doing a demo. And so I brought this huge rig of stuff, which kind of raised some concerns about me to them. They're like, why do you have all this stuff? I said, "Oh, I write songs." And then they said, "Can we hear them?" And I played them, "What do I have to do?"
And there it was.
And Walter, the keyboard player, said, "You got to join the band. You got to join the band." And then
that was the band's first big hit.
Correct.
Yeah. I remember being in Times Square.
Oh, yeah.
And seeing you on the giant screen for the video for that song.
I have photos of that because we would go to New York because we were selling to Columbia. And every time we had a break, we would fly to New York and do press and do photo shoots. And I was walking down the street with my camera, and it was on, and I took a picture of me, and I still have that picture somewhere. I think it's framed.
Yeah, no, I remember seeing, going, holy shit. I mean, at that point, the guys, this little Cleveland scene that we had, all of a sudden there were guys doing real shit.
Rich Patrick, Sean Bevan.
Rich Patrick with Filter, and Trent with 9 Inch Nails, and of course Sean Bevan as part of the 9 Inch Nails camp. So that was an interesting time. And at that time, I was working at Manny's, and I felt like a complete failure.
I remember that because I went to Manny's to see you when we were there on tour.
Yeah, and
I
I
think I
remember,
invited you on. I think I invited you to the gig. I don't
you
remember where
did.
we were
Yeah, we
playing.
went. I saw you several times in New York. That first one, I think, was at the Meadowland. No, uh,
Was
Irving.
it the or Stabbing Westward?
No, it was Stabbing Westward opening for Depeche, I think.
That would have been at Madison Square Garden.
Yeah. Okay. So I saw you three times open for Depeche Mode. Madison Square Garden, the Meadowlands Arena,
Right.
and then the Garden again, maybe on
But
the singles tour.
you must have seen me before that in New York, because with the we did the Songs of Faith and Devotion tour.
I did see you when I was working at Manny's, so that was very early because
Yeah.
when I first moved to New York, I got that job right away, and I wasn't there very long. Um, and then I worked. I got picked up by Korg as a product specialist, and then shortly after that, I got my break in production and remixing, and that's when my career started to go.
Right.
So all during that time, we were seeing each other on and off as you rolled through town, I think. And Rich
Yeah.
Carpenter, of course, your drum tech. So yeah,
Yeah.
I saw you guys so many times. Irving Plaza once too. Oh, I think you guys played with David Bowie's side project.
Oh,
Is
that
that
was Placebo was the
Tin
opening band.
Machine or something?
No, they were called Placebo, and Bowie had sang backup on their new single, and so they were
Oh,
a
that's right.
support
So he
band.
was just there that night.
Yeah, but he was one of the most wonderful people I've
No, I
ever.
know.
And
Yeah.
you've been to Irving Plaza a number of
Yeah.
times. The
Yeah.
main dressing room is upstairs, and then
Right.
the support dressing room is downstairs.
You got to
So he
walk through
shows
it.
up. You got to walk through to get down the stairs. So
Right.
Bowie shows up after their set with a gaggle of supermodels like Iman
Right. His future
uh,
wife.
and just a bunch of supermodels that came to
Oh,
the
that's
venue.
terrible.
They all hung out in our dressing room, and
Oh, what an awful evening that must have been.
we did. I think we did 3 nights at Irving Plaza, and he came to sing every night. And he walked in. He's like, "Hi, Andy, how you doing?" I'm like, "David Bowie remembered my name. He knew everybody's name. He was
He's a
super."
sweetheart. I was playing with a guy, David Baker, who was signed to Sony for a while, and we were playing that club Don Hills.
Oh yeah, I played there.
Remember Don Hills down on the west side of Manhattan, and so we were playing, and they were playing after us, and but David Bowie came in and sat and watched our whole set, like right in front of us. Talk about unnerving. And he was so gracious. I mean, he said hi to everybody, and it was pretty great. It was Reeve Gabriel's band that he was there to see.
Oh, Tin Machine, yeah.
Yeah, and so that he was, and you'd run into him all the time. Cy Kernan from the Fix, who I worked with a lot. His studio was downtown near this Irish pub called Puck Fair, and David Bowie would eat lunch there all the time. And we'd go in and we would look at him, but we wouldn't talk to him because we didn't want to bother him. But he was always there in that neighborhood. And New York was great in those days. You'd see everybody walking around. I think what people would be interested to know is, so you had this great career as a rock star, some hit records, a lot of touring. How did you make that transition from that to being a BMI award-winning composer for television?
Well, what had happened was I had been in Stabbing Westward. I played on 3 records. And after I turned 40 and I was kind of over the whole touring thing, I just didn't want to do it anymore. So I quit, and Jim Sellers, the bass player, quit. And then Stabbing Westward broke up. Then I went back to Cleveland for about a year. I left LA.
Brave.
Went back. Oh, dude. Well, I was running out of money, because Stabbing Westward had gotten dropped. So there were no more advances, and the touring was not happening. The band had its moment for a few years, and then MTV just ignored us. So I said, I'm going to go back to Cleveland. Went back to Cleveland. It was like the worst winter on record at that point, and it was just fucking miserable. I mean, but what I did was I produced local bands because I needed some money. So me and Rich Carpenter, we had a I rented a rehearsal space in the flats because you could get it for dirt cheap, and it was huge. And put all my gear in there and produced a bunch of local bands. And then I was just like, I made enough money to go back to LA for 1 year. I thought, I calculated what's it going to cost me to go back to LA. Went back to LA.
Now,
And
when you went back to LA, I had just moved there, right?
no, I think we went the other way. I think I had just gone to Cleveland and you came out to LA. So I think
Ah,
because you came out with Deb. So you guys were there
right.
at some point I went back and I was just kind of trying to get gigs, like anything, and nothing was happening. And then suddenly, like a month before I was going to have to give up, this television show called Monster Garage got dropped in my lap. My agent at the time, I had been writing like just catalog, like library catalog music for her, and she was getting it placed in television shows. And this show called Monster Garage on the Discovery Channel with the famous Jesse James, if people are unfamiliar with it, the bike guy. He was married to Sandra Bullock for a while.
It was one of the first real big reality build shows, right? Or probably the
Correct.
first. Yeah.
One of the very first, that along with Deadliest Catch. And so this was the company that did Monster Garage and Deadliest Catch. They had hired for Monster Garage for the first season, I think it was the owner's nephew was in a metal band. So he got the gig writing music, but they weren't happy with it. So they wanted somebody new. And so they heard about me and my pedigree of all these bands that I had played in. And so I got hired to come in to do Monster Garage. And it was metal, but they wanted it to be more melodic, more cinematic, instead of the original guy who just played drop E, there were like no chord changes in any of his cues. And so I went in, I met with them, they liked me, I got the gig, and I thought, okay, don't screw this up, man. This is your opportunity. So, I had gone to a conservatory. I was a classically trained percussionist, right? So I had done orchestration, I could do string arranging, I could do all that stuff. I'd never used those skills, got the gig, which led to another gig, which led to another gig. And after about 2 or 3 years, I think I was doing 10 or 11 series simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't sleep, and I never said no to another gig because you know how fickle LA is. The minute you say no, they're not going to call you back.
Sure.
So I just started working on all of these shows, and I started winning BMI awards and, the
20 years?
20 years I worked for that company, Original Production.
I did a lot of, my BMI statements have a ton of those shows on them. So through that time, I was doing stuff occasionally with you or for you.
Yeah.
And the early Monster Garage cues, I believe I mixed on my Pro Tools rig in Sherman Oaks.
You did. Because I was not happy with my mixing skills. So
this is a music production channel. How did you improve just by doing it? Did you do anything differently? Obviously the more that you, and I stress this on my channel, the more you create music, the more you write and mix music, the better you get, right?
Correct. So what happens is Monster Garage is mostly metalish sounding, guitars, drums, pretty standard. Then I got this show called Ballroom Boot Camp.
Oh God, I remember that.
A ballroom dancing show. And suddenly I had to do like sambas and things. And I'm like, this is where I first discovered sample libraries.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember, I don't know whether it was, I don't know whether Contact Player existed then. And it
did in its earlier forms.
Yeah. So I got whatever, I forgot what I got. I think I got Vienna Instruments. I got a couple of string libraries and a brass library.
And that's when things were starting to get really good.
Around
that time.
I had never played with these things. And I was like, how do I write a cue with this? It's a string sample. It's all staccato. This preset's all legato. And so you had to open up like 5 instances of the strings to get violins, violas, staccato, legato, and so it would take forever to record a string passage because it was really time consuming until I figured it out. And one day I was just like, I got it.
Key switches.
key switches, right? But then I just kind of looked back at my orchestral training and I thought, I can do string arrangements. I listen to things, I listen to a lot of film scores.
Mm-hmm.
And so as these shows morphed, so Ballroom Boot Camp was, you can imagine ballroom dancing music. There was a lot of jazz. There was a lot of, it was interesting. And then I got Axeman on the
I remember
Discovery.
that one.
On A&E, the original composer, like Monster Garage, got fired.
Mm-hmm.
And they dropped me in, and they just kept dropping me into shows. Like I ended up a year or two later, a few years later, they were doing this show called Storage Wars. And I was not the original composer on Storage Wars.
You weren't?
No, I wasn't the original. I was doing five, I think at that point, probably 5 series for them simultaneously. And this other guy was doing Storage Wars, and he was doing a couple other shows. I don't remember what they were. But they weren't happy with what he was doing. They had Tom Beers, the guy who owned Original Productions, who was the creator and mastermind behind all of these huge shows. He gave the original composer, one word. The composer said, "What do you want?" He said, "Spaghetti Western." I want, and the composer went, "I'm just going to write metal cues," because there's guys looking in storage lockers, right? So he dropped the ball. I was at the production facility in an editing bay, directly across. I mean, this editing bay was called the Green Mile. It was like 20 editing bays down this long hallway, and Tom Beers was literally in the bay right across the hallway. His door was open. The door was open for the show that I was working on, and I was sitting there with an editor, and we were going through like what he liked, what he needed. And I remember Tom Beers screaming at the editor that he hated the fucking music. This is not what I asked for. It's not what I asked for. And the editor said, "Well, Tom, we've already had this conversation, but I found this piece of music in our library that Andy Kubashevsky wrote. Tell me what you think about this." So at some point for some show, I had written a spaghetti Western cue. And he dropped it in, and Tom Beers is like, "That's it. That's the sound I want." And the editor leans back and he goes, "Well, Tom, Andy's right there." And he's like, "Kubashevsky, get in here."
I remember when you wrote that for that first one, because we were talking. In those days we talked on the phone probably every day.
Oh yeah.
And I remember you saying you were working on an Ennio Morricone kind of spaghetti Western track. And that's what led to you getting the Storage, which went on for what, 14 seasons?
It's been on for 15 seasons. It finally got canceled a couple of years ago, but it plays repeatedly on.
No, it's always on. Because I had done, several pieces of music with you throughout the years, and they're in that library. That's
sure.
Always shows up on my statements. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving, and much more so for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they fired this composer, and they took not just from Storage Wars, but from the other 3 or 4 shows that he was doing, and they added that to my workload on top of the 5, now 6 shows with Storage Wars. So I was doing like 10 shows. And dude, I didn't sleep. I would work.
No, I was going to say you had a very unusual schedule in those days. Like
I would work 72 hours straight, then I'd sleep for 12, 72 hours straight. And I mean, back in those days, it was so stressful because they didn't let me farm out music, because one of the reasons they booted the other guy was they didn't like what he was bringing. And it turns out he wasn't even writing the cues. He had just farmed it out to another composer.
Right. Exactly. That's really common.
Yeah, it's really common. And they were not happy. So they said, "You get to do these shows, but you have to do music. You want to co-write with people? That's fine. But they got to be working with you, not hired out." So you did a bunch of stuff with me because I was so overwhelmed, man.
There was one show that I did with you that I have those cues, and they're so good. Very organic. We used Frank Romano, the guitar player, a lot on like banjos and man, those cues, I was going through old hard drives, and a bunch of those cues came up, and they were really good. I hope they're using them somewhere. I don't know. I don't really hear them anywhere. And of course,
Yeah, they do get used. That show Cole, I think, only lasted one season.
yeah, but the
Um,
cues were good. I
yeah, and they
remember.
got used in a bunch of other shows. I'm sure if you look at your BMI statements, they'll
I
still
mean, at
pop
this
up.
point, when you do television, as long as you and I did it, and you much more so than me, my BMI statement is 75 pages, and I'm sure yours is a telephone book.
Mine's about 750 pages.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
when those things come in, I mean, I glance at them, you know, but it's like, to sit and go through all that stuff. I don't know. It's a
It's for me, I've written somewhere between 9 and 10,000 cues
right.
for original productions and for television. So, a lot of these shows they play all over the world. Every time I go to London, I chuckle because I'll turn on the TV and it's a Storage Wars marathon in
Yeah.
London. You
Yeah.
know, some of these other countries, Canada, Australia, um, there's like 5 or 6 countries that have their own Storage Wars. It's like Storage Wars Australia, Storage Wars.
And are they using the same catalog of music?
They use some of it, but what they do is they tailor it so it matches like the musical style of that particular country. It's like Storage Wars Bulgaria or something. So they use Money Owns This Town, the theme, but they rearrange it to fit the country that they're in
Right. Did
musically.
you write that theme? No.
Money Owns This Town, yeah,
But you
that
did
was big.
write that. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
that's good. So they rearrange it and change it, but you still own it. Well, you don't own it, but you still own the writer's share.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah, yeah, that's great.
absolutely, yeah. And so what happened too? Storage Wars had run its course and it had been canceled, and I think we were at season 12, and then the pandemic hit. Everybody's at home, nobody's working, and then
Boy, I
Black
remember.
Lives
Yep.
Black Lives Matter happened the same time. Everybody is depressed. So A&E, the company that we had done Storage Wars for, suddenly was under a lot of pressure because they had this show on called Cops. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
It
Of
was
course.
basically police officers arresting non-white criminals. And
Right.
because of Black Lives Matter, they pulled it off the air and they thought, we're just going to do Storage Wars marathons. And then suddenly the show popularity came back because everybody's at home, nobody's at a job,
Right.
everybody's depressed, and they're watching Storage Wars and they're liking it because it kind of took them from their reality into. And then the show came back for 3 more seasons after that. So had it not been for the pandemic.
True. And it's funny because I was talking to somebody about this because a similar thing, but different, happened to me as well. Because, well, television production just stopped, right?
Yes,
Everything stopped. So
yes,
there was no new television. So in comes this flux of reruns, Storage Wars, and every other show too. And
yes.
so while most of the world is suffering through this thing, my royalty payments are going through the roof because they're
Yep,
rerunning all these old television shows.
yep.
That was interesting. It's like, oh, I see why. Because they can't produce any new TV, so they're digging into the archives and re-airing everything else.
Well, you know what they did after a couple months at Original, and I'm sure they weren't the only company to do this, is they went and they set up rigs in all the editors' houses.
Hmm.
And they wired it into their mainframe at Original. So now everybody's working remotely, but they've got the identical rig in everybody's house. They essentially took apart the editing bays and moved them to editors' houses. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so the show comes back, and then we worked like that. But there was a lot more virtual, um, communication between me and
Well,
editors.
and I think what a lot of young composers might not realize is that these editors have a lot of control. And as they develop a catalog of things that work for them, it follows them to different projects.
Oh,
And
sure.
I'm sure that, I mean, on my television statements, there are dozens of shows that I had nothing to do with, or didn't work on with you because the editor on X show took his bag of tricks with him to another show, and this cue always worked in this situation, so they plugged that cue in, and
Yeah.
next thing you know, you're on a different television show that you weren't even aware of. And that's one of the beautiful things about reality TV is
Yeah, I
such
mean,
the
it's
appetite for music.
even to this day when I get my BMI statement, I'm always chuckling because I'm like, I got 100 cues in this television series that I've never heard of.
Exactly. Same here, and that's what it is. These, the editors, they just, it's like anything else, man. Like when you or I are working on something and a certain situation comes up, you have your bag of tricks that you dig into to get that done. And the
Yep.
editors are no different. When there's a moment in a show and they need to create a certain feeling, they have their bag of tricks, man, and they go to it because they have to work fast and it works.
Oh yeah, and if it hadn't been for those editors, and just me getting the opportunity to do the show, I don't know what I'd be doing now.
Well, but also, developing your skills, spending the time to really do it. And what I stress all the time on my channel is using reference tracks to compare your music and the quality of what you're doing, constantly upping your game. And that's what you did over the course of all those years very regularly.
I never in my wildest dreams, I figured once I got into the rock band thing, that was it for me. Until I turned 40 and I was just over touring and I was over the fact that with Stout and Westward, the arc had gone and then it left. And so
Right.
it was pointless for me to carry on. But I never imagined that I would have a room full of ridiculousness. It's like,
Well, yeah, that's crazy. But so we'll get to that in a minute, but run down like what your rig was like, what you were using during the heavy lifting days, because now you're basically retired from television, right?
yeah, because a lot of these companies like Original, they're around, but they don't hire composers anymore. They just use library music.
Yeah, because they had 10,000 tracks from you. But what during the heavy lifting days, what were you relying on the most in your productions? What was your rig like? What kind of computer were you using? Just, spend a minute or two and just run down kind of what your setup was.
I would have been using whatever Macintosh was the best that was there. I don't, it was a Mac Pro or something, whatever, you know. And so that's when I bought a lot of sample libraries because I needed strings and I needed brass. And so there were more and more of these coming.
Like contact instruments.
Yeah, yeah. And then even the things that were kind of pre-contact or things that were similar to contact, but they
So a lot
weren't
of
like,
VSTIs, obviously,
yes.
because you need to work quickly.
Yes. And so, you would get from the editors what they were looking for. They would tell me, I need this, this, this. So I had a list of everything I needed to do. And I would just like, a Mac, and I used Apogee. I mean, very similar to what I have here, except this stuff is obviously newer. Like I bought an Apogee interface, one of the very first Apogees. Still have them, a very nice set of Adams studio monitors.
That's what I use.
And as I became more successful and made more money, the studio would grow. I went from using
Yeah.
a tiny studio desk to getting, I think you had, I forgot the company in LA.
Yeah, we both had custom desks made.
Yeah, from the same
Yeah.
company. And
I
so
don't remember. I don't remember the name of the company. I don't think they're around anymore.
yeah, I don't think they were. And I think, it's like you would one up me on something and then my money would get bigger than I would come and I said, oh, it's a good desk. And I would try that. Then we were, you and I and a couple other people, I think Doug DeAngelis and a
Yep.
couple of the other guys, we'd all talk a lot. Like if I would go to Original Productions and I would go to see the music supervisor every day or something and drop off my cues, and there'd be another composer sitting in there and we would all talk and then he would say, have you tried this? No, never heard. So a lot of word of mouth. And, and a lot of it came from you too, because you knew all the guys that were doing like stylists. And
Yeah, I was really dialed into the MI world because of my relationship with Korg.
with Korg, right?
So I knew a lot of. So I was lucky that I would get a lot of that stuff, even sometimes pre-release.
Yeah, but just a lot of word of mouth and
Sure.
a lot of guys like us who were, had gotten their foot in the door, but now I needed more information on how do I make my strings sound more lifelike instead of less mechanical, and it was like, that's when they learned about key switching and all these other things, and people would turn me on to other libraries. And there were guys that made little tiny string libraries, guys that lived in LA, and you could buy them for like $75 or something. Or every couple of weeks, you'd get a new library and be like, oh my God, the brass is in this one is great. The strings
Right.
are in the other. So we would all mix and match our favorite, we'd have 8
Well,
orchestral libraries open.
the appetite for music in those shows is so voracious that you have to almost buy and use everything to keep up
Yes.
with the demand, so we were all in that world together, so we were always trying to help each other in that regard, which was great. It was a good community.
Yeah, and it was a lot of fun, because
Yeah,
and the thing that I enjoyed about it immensely was the fact that I didn't have to tour as a rock drummer
yeah,
anymore.
it's nice to be home, man.
Yeah, and when we would work, like you and I would go get lunch like once a week. We'd go to Gordon
Gordon
Beer
Birch.
down the
Yeah.
street, drink
I
too
think it
much
was more
alcohol.
than once a week. Didn't they one winter, didn't they give us like $300 gift certificates to Best Buy or something?
Yeah, but it was like, my schedule. I'd work my butt off for a couple of days and then have a break, and we would go get
Right.
lunch. So it was a cycle that just kind of repeated itself.
No, it
But yeah,
was great.
it was good. And then we would just talk about, hey, did you hear about this? Hey, try these. Hey, I got these great studio monitors, And so
Yeah. I think
as
I don't know who bought the Adams first, but I still use them.
yeah, I've got them sitting here. And then at some point I
I'm on
ended
my
up,
second pair.
these are the same ones that I've had for 20 some odd years. And
Yeah.
at some point when I was starting to make a lot of money, I bought my first set of
The
Barefoots.
Barefoots, yeah.
And it was like 10 grand on studio monitors. And I'm
I
thinking,
think they're even more now.
I know I have the new ones and they're just incredible. I mean, I just love the sound of these things. But I mean, I was getting to that point where I needed instruments. So I still have like 25 guitars and I've got,
No.
you
Well,
know,
you went guitar crazy first. But so now for those of you that don't know, and Andy has one of the most impressive synth collections I've ever seen. So what you should do, I mean, you can't see all of it here. You see some of the modular stuff, but you got to send me some snaps that I could put into this. And so how did that start as you were still working in TV, or was that afterwards? Did you start collecting these analog synths and going from working primarily in a VST environment for television to a completely analog environment for a current project that we'll talk about here in a sec?
well, when I started to make money, a couple years into my tenure at Original Productions, um, and it takes a couple of years because you would get a per, back in those days, you'd get a per cue fee. I think it was like $300 or something per cue. It wasn't a lot, but
It
you
was the
had to
back
wait.
end that,
It took a couple of years for the back end to start
sure. It's
to
always
show.
behind a bit.
Yeah. And so, I still had a couple of my cents from the Exotic Birds days because, remember, Exotic Birds was a synth pop band,
Yes,
right?
sir. I
So I
still have my
still had,
Emacs. Well, I bought a new one,
so I
a new
still had
old
the
one.
I still had the love of sense. I kept in touch in LA. Ed Buller lived in LA for years, and I played drums for him. And Ed produced the last Stabbing Westward record that I was on. And I met Ed originally in the very first version of the Birds because we opened for the Psychedelic Furs at Kent State University, and Ed was the keyboard player.
Oh, right.
So we have had a friendship that has lasted since the early 80s.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Ed is a synth monster. Ed's in a British band called Node with Flood and a couple other guys, and it's all vintage modular stuff. So after a while, Ed was like, dude, you got to get into modular. So I bought a little Eurorack rig, I bought like a case with a couple of modules, and then I just got addicted to it. And I eventually ended up, I mean, I don't know if you can see it, but back in the back, there's a Moog modular.
Well, I'll post some pictures. I mean, it's so hard to do it justice, even in photographs, let alone on this camera. Yeah, you get an idea there.
Yeah. And so I just kind of, the thing about it is when you're a musician, what can you write off? What are you allowed to write off, right? Equipment.
Instruments. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would be like, okay, then I'm going to go buy, a custom-made modular synth from Gert Yalis at Moon Modular. So what started out as kind of write-offs suddenly became, I was like, I remember being in a synth pop band and enjoying it. And after, when I toured with Depeche Mode twice, once in on the devotional tour, and then a couple years later on the singles tour, and I would sit there every night. And I know that your love and appreciation of Depeche Mode is just like mine. It's just great pop songs, and the programming and the production and everything about it was amazing. So I just thought, I'm going to do that. And I started to buy rare vintage instruments because these things aren't around anymore. There's very few of them left, and they're all investments, essentially.
Right.
And
that, of course, all these instruments have led you to this project you're working on now with Andrea Becker.
Right. Discotheque,
which is fucking great, by the way.
Right before the pandemic hit, I remember I was kind of slowing down in the production world because at that point, Storage Wars had run its course.
You were getting ready you were talking about retiring even a couple of years before that.
Yeah, because I was burned out.
Right.
I mean, my schedule was ridiculous, and the fact that I couldn't farm anything out to anybody meant I had to be part of pretty much everything that was happening. And it just kind of took its toll after a while. So I remember one day, and Andrea Becker, who's my bandmate, who will be here on Friday, by the way, for a week.
I know Andrea well. We worked together on a few television shows.
Yeah, and so we're going to try and finish up some of these songs. But at some point, she was over singing, and I said, I want to do a synth pop band. I want to go back to that part of my life. How about we work on some songs? And so we did. And, we've got a few EPs out and a bunch of singles and some
we'll
videos.
link all that stuff in the show notes. It's really good.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a lot more now that I've spent so much time as a composer. If you compare what I do now electronically to what we did in Exotic Birds back in those days, the Exotic Bird stuff seems very primitive.
I mean, obviously you get a lot better at your craft. Number one, the gear. How much money did we have when we were in Exotic Birds? We had nothing. So you were limited in the instruments and the resources. Not only were those resources themselves limited compared to the way they are now, but we didn't have any money to buy anything.
No, I would spend, back in my Cleveland days when I was playing in Exotic Birds, I was a session drummer, and I made a pretty good living playing on commercials and jingles and things. Because at that point in the 80s, Cleveland was kind of a hub. It was like Cleveland and Chicago, New York were kind of. So in Cleveland, it was kind of like a regional hub. Like we did all the television music for Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. You're very regional. You had like a 5 or 6 state kind of territory where these jingle companies that I was playing drums for were doing all the work. And so when I would get that money, when we were in the Birds, I'd save up my pennies and I'd go to Pi Keyboards and Audio and I'd buy an SP1200 drum machine, which cost like $3,000 or something.
I think they were even more. I mean, my very first Emax, I think was $4,500 in 1987 money.
Yeah.
I played in a lounge band for 6 months, 6 nights a week to buy that, along with working my day job at Pi Keyboards.
Yep. I was the same way. I'd save up the money and we'd buy gear,
Right.
And so the love of the electronics and my love of like bands like Depeche Mode, and there's so many really good bands out there who use this stuff.
Of course.
It just kind of grew and grew and grew. And at some point, my obsession with synthesizers overtook my obsession with owning a bunch of guitars because I was doing.
Yeah, man, you went guitar nuts for a while. Do you still have all those guitars?
I've got a lot of them. Yeah, I probably still have 20, 25 of them. I think at one point I had like 40, and I sold
remember seeing your synth rig for the first time in your new house and being like, you have a synth problem, but you refer to it as a synth solution.
Well, what?
It's like, how do you even know with a room like that, like where to begin?
The thing is that, I think a lot of people would walk into a room like mine and they would see all the, just like the mods, not the modules, but all the analog synths, like vintage Jupiter, vintage Oberheim. I've got a 4-voice sat right
They're all
here.
there.
they're all there, but they all sound different. They all have
Sure
different
do. Yeah.
personalities. And, nowadays you can buy plugins and they're great emulations of a lot of these things.
Not
But
the same though, really. Come on.
no, it's not the same. It's although I use them sometimes, like when I'm like I just sent Andrea, my bandmate, 13 demos of 13 songs. And the thing is that, you know, she's got a great voice, but depending upon what's happening in the track, the key needs to be different. So I
Right.
learned
Oh, of
valuable
course.
lesson. I tracked an entire tune using old analog gear, and it was like wrong key,
Takes so
can't
long.
sing it.
It
So
takes
now
so long.
I do quick sketches with some plugins, and then
So that's
one
interesting. So you do sketches with the VSTs, and then
correct.
as the song develops and you're going to do it for real, you go to the actual vintage and analog instruments.
Yeah, correct. Because what you don't want to do is spend a week or two tracking only to have her walk in and go, "Can you raise it up 2 steps?" It's
Oh,
like,
that's maddening. It's funny because I did a track last November called November Fever Dreams that's on iTunes. And I consciously said I'm not using any VSTs. I'm going to use
yeah,
all hardware. I have a couple synths here, and then I have a few more over here that you out of eye shot that you can't see. And I used all hardware on this thing, and it took 5 times longer than it would take you to do a cue or a track using VSTs. But man,
well,
there's something
but
really satisfying about it.
yeah, there is. But the one thing too is that, like the synth set behind you, they're modern, so they don't have intonation problems. Turn on
Well,
the
they're
overhead.
analog. Both of the well, no, the top one is analog. It definitely goes out,
Yeah.
and you have one of those, right? A Trigon.
Oh yeah, it goes out all the
It
time.
goes out. You can retune it, but the Hydra synth is like a hybrid model thing, so that doesn't have that issue. And then I've got a sequential over here that they're actual VCAs, so they do drift, but not like they did in the old days.
Well,
You
that's
know,
what I'm saying because I
yeah.
like to use some of the old things.
Well, yeah, I would use them too if I had them.
It's like one of the things that really started to drive me mad when I first got into modulars like Eurorack was keeping them in tune. I have tuners. I've got like 5 tuners in this room. Like every corner, there's a tuner, so I can sit there and get it. Okay, track it. Oh, now it's drifted. Go back, tune it again, track a little more, and I end up sometimes piecing bits and pieces together because you play an octave and it wouldn't be an octave because of the drift, and it's just like, yeah. So I learned my lesson on one track with her where I spent a couple of weeks putting it together, and it's still just sitting on my hard drive as an instrumental that is never
No,
going to
I
be.
know. It's a different world, but you're retired from TV. You have the time to do that now, so it's a labor of love.
Yeah, it is really, and it's fun. I mean, it's sometimes frustrating, working with another musician. You know,
Well, she's terrific, but she has definite ideas about what she wants to do, and
Well, sure, because I wanted it to be the two of us working together. I didn't want to just write a bunch of songs and hire her to sing them. I wanted
right.
it to be an actual band kind of scenario. So,
She was great on the television shows too because she's such a chameleon.
yeah.
I mean, I did one television show with Doug DeAngelis where we had to the it was a dance show or something, and they were using popular music, and they could afford to license the track but not the master. So we were recreating masters to these like old Blondie songs and Britney Spears songs and things like that, and I would do all the music and programming, and she'd come in and become that vocalist, and it was pretty crazy to watch.
Yeah, Andre's really great. That's why she does voiceovers now and has
Right.
done for
Yeah.
years because she's kind of the same way when she speaks.
Yeah.
If they need her to be, from a certain zone in the UK, if she's
Yeah.
supposed to sound like
No,
she's
she's
from
wildly
Manchester.
talented with that stuff. She was, and you would never know, like you would never know it was the same singer on all of those different things. So,
No, that's what was great about Andrea and still is she's very flexible
do you
and
guys have anything new planned besides this new batch of demos? Is that going to be the next release?
well, I sent like I said I sent her 13 and they are sketches. Um and I have some vocal ideas, melody ideas, some lyrics. I want to make sure that when we write the lyrics, we write them together. I don't want to write something and, force her to sing it. But a lot of them are just sketches because I want to have her be part of the creative process. And she no longer lives in Los Angeles. She lives in Boise, Idaho. So back in the day, she would just come over and we would work. Now I fly her in
a little bit more difficult now with that.
a little bit more. And
Do you guys do any remote working using like audio movers or any of that stuff?
No, because I have a much better microphone selection than she does.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And so she will sing like demos of things, but she does primarily voiceovers. So the microphones that she uses, they're not first, you can use them, you can sing into them and record it, obviously. But, I put up like a vintage, Neumann or a vintage, and it's just sounds phenomenal. I retired from doing TV a couple of years ago, and I just kind of sit around my studio and write pop songs. And
why not, man?
It's a lot of fun, and it's not stressful, which I really like.
So, Andy, thanks for doing this, man. It's the maiden voyage of this. Just people that have had interesting careers, and hopefully people will get some value or inspiration out of it or something.